This is our fifth and final, I promise, video on our demography module. So let's quickly talk about the learning objectives. There are only two. First, I would like all of you to be able to understand what is meant by the dependency ratio, and also I'd like you to be relating it to RNI. What's the connection between the two? Finally, I just want to point to something that's happening in the world right now with regard to the crude birth rate. Turns out, the crude birth rate is going down everywhere. And what that basically thus means is that every place is progressing into stage 4 of the demographic transition. And we'll talk about what that means at the very end of today's final, fifth video on demography. So, let's begin by talking about the dependency ratio. The dependency ratio is something that demographers use. And what it basically does is it tells us the proportion of a society that is dependent or independent. So let's explain how that's done. What a demographer might do is they would literally count up the number of people in any society, let's say the United States of America, or Canada, or Mexico, or what have you. And once you've done so, you want to put people into various categories based on the age cohort in which they are found. So, people who are newborns all the way to about age 14, we're going to call them dependent. What that basically means is they're not working and they're not paying taxes. They're not paying taxes to the federal government or to the government of the states, which would be the case here in the United States of America. Notice that there is another category of dependent people by and large, and those are people who are 65 and over. They've retired. They may have money that they're living off of, but they're also collecting a Social Security check. And although they may be paying taxes, they're not paying the same level of taxes that they were earlier in their careers. So we are also going to call the 65 and over population a dependent population. In contrast, people in the middle part of their life cycle, between let's say the ages of 15 and roughly 64, we're going to call them independent. Another word that demographers and economists might use is they are in their productive years. This is not to suggest that older people are not productive. They are. This is also not to suggest that younger people, teens and children, aren't productive. They are. But they're not productive in the sense that they are paying taxes to the federal government, which of course is then collectivized and pooled, and that's where the Social Security checks that are cut every month come from, in the case of the United States specifically. Now once you've done this, once you've figured out the percent of the population in each one of these three categories, you can collapse the two dependent categories together. And then you can create a ratio that would basically represent the proportion of the population that is dependent and the proportion of the population that is independent. So, how do you calculate the dependency ratio? It's pretty simple. What you would do is create a ratio of the dependent population. So you put that first, which in this case is going to be the young people and the old people. And then you also want to connect it to the productive population, which is those people in the middle part of their life cycle. The dependency ratio then is represented as follows. It is the ratio of the dependent population to the productive population. So you start with the dependent, then typically it's represented with a colon, followed by the percent of the population that is productive. So what I would like to do then is give you an example. In an ideal situation, the best possible situation, the dependency ratio would be 1 to 2. In other words, there would be 2 productive individuals for every dependent individual. So 2 people in their middle part of the life cycle paying taxes for every single individual who is not. But guess what? Almost never is this ideal situation found in reality. There's always going to be something that basically disrupts this perfect case situation. So I'll give you one example. If you find a country in stage 2 and or stage 3 of the demographic transition, that typically means that you've got a lot of young people. The median age might only be something like 20 or even 18. You've got a lot of young people because the crude birth rate is still pretty high. And what that means is the dependency ratio can move over to something like this, 1-to-1. Where for every working individual who is paying taxes, you have another person who is basically living off of that tax money in the form of maybe a Social Security check or in terms of spending on education and daycare. And so that then becomes a really dangerous situation fiscally for that particular country. Too many young people can mean that that government is operating in the red. Now, interestingly, guess what? If the crude birth rate falls too low, the exact same thing can happen. The dependency ratio can increase towards 1-to-1, just as it was the case here. And I'll give you an example of how that's happening in another part of the world. What if you're in stage 4 of the demographic transition, where you've got a really low crude birth rate, but what if it gets too low so that you actually get an RNI that is negative? That means you've got too many older people relative to how many younger people you have. This is the case in certain parts of the world like Japan, where you've got a large percentage of the population that is elderly and a comparatively tiny percent of the population that is young or even in their middle age. And what that means is Japan probably has a dependency ratio that looks a lot like the dependency ratio of a country in stage 2 or stage 3 of the demographic transition. But it's a different kind of problem. Instead of having too many young people, in the case of Japan, they have too many old people. It's a problem we see all across the world today, associated with the so-called graying of society, where it becomes almost impossible for that government to keep issuing the equivalent of Social Security checks when there aren't that many people paying taxes. And so the government has the real risk of running in the red and becoming fiscally unsound. Then the government has to borrow money and eventually they go into debt. And this can be a problem all across the world as it is today in places like Greece, Italy, and Spain, where the problem really is that the dependency ratio is too close to 1-to-1. All right, now what I'd like to do is show how that is expressed spatially. In countries like the United States and also some West European states and Japan and Australia that are clearly in stage 4 of the demographic transition, we already know what that means. It means that the rate of natural increase is going to be low. It also means in some instances, not all, but especially in the case of Japan, where there isn't a large number of young immigrants coming to that particular country, that the dependency ratio is getting dangerously close to 1-to-1, thus threatening the fiscal sound nature of the Japanese state, of the government. The exact same thing can be true at the other end of the spectrum, where you have basically a high RNI, which means you're in stage 3 of the demographic transition, possibly even stage 2. So let's just choose one of the countries with the red color tone. Let's talk about Mali. The Mali situation is kind of the opposite of what it is in Japan. Instead of having too many old people, there may be in fact too many young people. You've got that triangular shaped population pyramid with a high crude birth rate and a high RNI, and the effect of that then is that the dependency ratio is less than ideal, resulting in a dependency ratio that is closer to 1-to-1. Now, in a way, a lot of this is kind of a moot point, and the reason is because almost everywhere in the world, the rate of natural increase is going down, and it's going down quickly. In fact, if you look really carefully at this graph right here, and I realize it's kind of hard to see, but what it shows us is the year 2000 on the left and the year 2050 on the right. So these are merely projections. They're not actual data points, but we can kind of look at current trends and then make some pretty powerful guesstimates about what's going to happen in the near future. The top panel is basically what's happening in the world. Then we have here the more developed regions, i.e. the global north. And then we have the so-called global south, represented by these two right here. Less developed regions followed by the least developed regions. Now, let's start out with just the year 2000. If you look, the population pyramid in global south situations is more triangular. That means the RNI is high and the crude birth rate is high, and you're basically in stage 3 of the demographic transition. But look at the year 2050, and you notice that basically all of these triangular shaped population pyramids are disappearing, and we're progressing more towards a rectangular shaped population pyramid nearly everywhere. The result is that a lot of people think that almost every country in the world will soon be in stage 4 of the demographic transition. Crude birth rates are dropping nearly everywhere. The rate of natural increase is correspondingly dropping nearly everywhere. But the negative effect of this is that the dependency ratio might still progress closer to 1-to-1, because globally there may be too many old people relative to people in their productive years. And just as the case is in Japan currently, that idea that the governments of the world will become less fiscally sound because they're spending more than they're taking in could actually spread from places like Japan or Greece or Spain and actually become a global problem. This is why a lot of people say demography is destiny, because it has effects on the economy, on politics, and all sorts of other aspects of social and cultural life. This concludes our module on demography. Next, we're going to discuss one aspect of demography, I suppose you could say, and it's basically going to look like a discussion of international immigration using the United States of America as our case study. So I'll see all of you soon.